Peace, family. Welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. Before we get started, if you're watching on YouTube, please do like, comment, subscribe. Also hit the notification button. In addition, I would ask that you add yourself to my channel on Telegram. Telegram is a decentralized platform. I use it to update people, and it's one where I don't have to worry about censorship. In addition, you could also add yourself to my channel on Odyssey. Odyssey is essentially the same thing as YouTube, except it is decentralized, so censorship also is not an issue there. I do have a few quick announcements before I get started with this video. One, obviously, we want to say, give our condolences to our brothers and sisters who are in Haiti, who have been fighting a good fight, who have faced another tragedy with this horrible 7.2 earthquake. I'm going to put a link inside of the description to the organization which the brother who I interviewed, Kweku Lumumba, is a part of. It's a Haitian-based organization. It's one that you can trust that your donations are actually going to the right people. I'll also be donating there. So that's one thing that we can do to hopefully help our brothers and sisters, as well as continue to give them your prayers, your support, and your solidarity. In addition, I do want to announce I'm going to be taking about a 1-month hiatus. I will be traveling, and therefore I will not be making videos during that time. If you want to see any updates from me during that time, you could see it on Telegram. And also I'll probably be posting things on Instagram, but other than that, I will not be posting anything to YouTube. So today obviously is an interesting day. A lot of you have probably been glued to the news screen watching news about the Taliban and how the United States has essentially failed in their operations inside of Afghanistan, like many people knew was going to happen for a long time coming. But the interesting thing is Africa, a continent that has more and more seen these waves of insurgency, is now meant to continue to go along with the Western agenda as far as allowing occupation of their countries by U.S. military forces. That is supposed to continue, despite the fact that we see over and over again, repeated throughout history, repeated throughout today, that the presence of foreign forces inside of the African continent, colonial forces, imperialist forces, that does nothing for the good or the betterment of African people. The
bottom line is that the U.S. military does do things clandestinely, does do things undercover. Sometimes it does things under disguise. The U.S. operation on the ground in Africa is quite extensive. In many cases, it goes beyond what the Senate in the US, and very much so what the American people would expect. In the case of Africa, which, as we do know, Islamic terrorism has a foothold, it's questionable as to whether the US operation, its influence on the ground, whether that in itself has caused or has extended the terrorists to be able to recall or actually extend their stay in the areas which they claim.
African people, this has been proven over time. You can look over at conflict, and you don't even have to stay in Africa. Go outside of Africa, go to places where other indigenous people live, and you'll see how U.S. occupation or French occupation or British occupation, these forces mean no good to the African people, because they're only to solidify their interest in the region. That they're more likely to get access to natural resources. That they're to have a military base that is going to be a reinforcement inside of the environment, that their presence is one that should be acknowledged and that their rules should be obeyed. So it has no good for our people. This has been established over time. Despite that, though, some people are still asking for more assistance from the United States. So I'm going to actually read through a letter by the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. Many of you probably remember, probably a couple months ago at this point, he had put out a call to the United States saying that we want there to be the AFRICOM, the U.S. military forces African operation. We want you to come into our jurisdiction. We want you to actually be in Africa. Right now, I believe it's based over in Germany or something like that. We want you to be located in Africa because we want you to be closer to us. You know, this imperialist military force that has only destabilized the region. We want more military force force to destabilize our region. And of course, Muhammadu Buhari is a Western puppet leader. He is not representative of the masses of the people. He's representative of a class of bourgeoisie Africans who are complicit with the colonial system that continues to exist inside of not just Nigeria, but the entire African continent. So of course, he's going to speak and say things that the Americans want him to say, because that is what he's there for. That is what he was created for. He's the prototypical African Western neo-colonialist puppet, and he's playing his role. But he actually wrote a letter, and it's funny. I think he actually said something that he probably didn't mean to say, that actually says some truth about the situation. Of course, his analysis is always going to be more so of a come save us white people, come save us Europeans, and not so much a liberate ourselves African people message. But even inside of this message, there's some truth that he had to admit about the reasons why insurgency has occurred at Africa at such a time as this. So we're going to read through this letter. And of course, the link will be in the description. It says, the lessons we learned from Afghanistan. Buhari writes on Taliban takeover, terrorism fears. President Muhammadu Buhari has stated that if extremist groups are able to hold any territory, such can inspire disillusioned people to commit acts of terror in their own countries. So he's saying that the people who do these things are disillusioned people. These are not people of means that actually have opportunities that are just going out and just, the narrative that's been pushed inside of the media is that when you see people who are labeled terrorists or people who are labeled as militants or insurgents, that these people just hate freedom, that they just got up one day and say, we just want to stop everyone from enjoying freedom, stop everyone from being happy because that's just what we want. He's admitting right here that these are disillusioned people. Disillusioned meaning you believed inside of a cause, you believed inside of something, you believed maybe that your country was for you, maybe you believed that Africa would rise, maybe you believed that this society is equal and that colonialism has been abolished. Maybe you believe these things, but during the test of time, you've come to realize that these things that you believed were not based on a rational basis because your experience has only reinforced that these things are not so. He then stated that Africa needs more than military aid to defeat terror. So he goes on to say, Buhari added that Africa appeared to be the new front line of global militancy, saying the uprising in Afghanistan came in a momentum not so expected. The president argued that COVID-19 was a distraction to most countries, including Africa, to fight terrorism headlong. He wrote, though some believe the war of terror on terror, and that's significant right there that he's even saying the war on terror, because that was a saying that was created by George Bush in order to incite feelings inside of people. So we're not just going to war, there's a war on terror. It was meant to incite fear inside of people who are in America or inside of live in Western countries to justify United States intervention and military exploits all over the world. So the fact that, again, on the colonial puppet, he's saying the war on terror, he's using the language of the oppressor. And the oppressor creates these sayings and these languages as a way to continue to control us. If you talk like us, then you will do what we tell you to say, because your understanding of the world will be determined by the vocabulary that you use to describe the world. For example, if we're talking about Africa, you might say, oh, Africa needs development. But someone else might say Africa needs revolution. Well, which one is going to lead to changing the condition of the masses? Revolution, not development, not investment. So using war on terror, that tells you that he's using the language of the oppressor to further the narrative that Africa is facing a threat that has nothing to do with the colonial past and present conditions of the continent. But he says the war on terror winds down with the U.S. departure from Afghanistan. The threat it was supposed to address burns fiercely on my continent. Africa is the new front line of global militancy. Why is that the case? This should be the question. Yet few expect the outlay expended here to be as great as in Afghanistan. The fight against terrorism begun under the George W. Bush administration was never truly global. He said, despite rising attacks across Africa in the past decade, international assistance has not followed in step. Mozambique is merely the latest African state in danger of terrorism. The Sahel remains vulnerable to Boko Haram 20 years after its formation and other radical groups. Somalia is in the second decade fighting the equally extreme al-Shabaab. Many African nations are submerged under the weight of insurgency. As Africans, we face our day of reckoning. Just as some sense, the West is losing its will for the fight. Yes. And it is true that some of our Western allies are bruised by their Middle Eastern and Afghan experiences. So what Buhari is doing here is very interesting. He is making his plea to the West. Listen, we had insurgency or militancy or terrorism. We've had it in this region. We've had it in that region. And you guys have been so focused on the Middle East that you've forgotten us poor Africans who can't fight for ourselves. We need you to come and fight for us. He also does so, though, very cleverly, drawing attention to different situations that have manifested over African recent history. And we know that there's been other instances of different types of civil unrest inside of African countries. We know this is a long history. But of course, while he will call out Somalia, while he'll call out Mozambique, while he'll call out Nigeria, he'll call out all these countries, he doesn't want to call out the Western countries that are responsible for those countries being in a predicament that they are in the first place. This is a typical thing that neocolonial puppets do. You'll try to put the blame on where the blame doesn't belong, and you'll try to avoid the true ones who are the violators of Africans' rights. You'll try to ignore their role because you understand that that would essentially be calling out your master. This is the system that has allowed for puppets like Buhari to continue to hold on to power because they're not truly interested in the interests of Africa. I personally don't know how anyone who has a true interest inside of the stability of Africa does not once mention the words colonialism. How is it that the continent that was colonized barely even has leaders that will speak directly to the colonial system? But this is all by design, and Buhari, of course, is put into this position by design. And so instead of calling out the colonial atrocities of the West against African people, he reverts to calling out the unwillingness of these colonial masters to come and help them whenever they're facing the results and the outcomes of being under a colonial siege for a long time. Now, we're going to go on. It says, others face domestic pressure after the pandemic. Africa was not then, and even less now, their priority, but the threat cannot be ignored. COVID-19 has been like oxygen for terrorism, allowing it to gain strength while the world was preoccupied. Sooner or later, the reverberations will be felt beyond Africa. If extremist groups are able to hold territory, it can inspire disillusioned people living in the West to commit heinous acts of terrorism in their own country. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic did not create anything that was not already there inside of Africa. It only exacerbated conditions that were already present. Same thing inside of African communities abroad. People who are suffering, whether you are inside of the United States, if you see that there are higher rates of Africans in the US who are suffering, you should also know that those conditions were already set. There's always going to be a disproportionate outcome whenever your community is vulnerable, unable to protect itself, and put inside of subservient positions that require you to go out, possibly in harm's way, and work dangerous jobs, work jobs where you're not adequately protected. So these things were already built in, and which is why previous to the COVID-19 pandemic, we also seen African people in the United States and African people abroad, African people in the Caribbean, African people in Europe, African people everywhere having disparate outcomes. So something like COVID, you put that inside of the mix, it's only going to make things worse. In the case of African people who are living inside of extreme insecurity, living in unstable environments, whenever you already can't take care of yourself, add a pandemic on that, of course, that's going to only be a flashlight, a beaming light rather, to show all of the inadequacies that were already present, and put the West in a position where they can't so easily pretend that these things aren't happening like they usually do. Now it says, if Afghanistan has taught us a lesson, notice he says us, has taught us a lesson, it is that although sheer force can blunt terror, its removal can cause the threat to return. The U.S. and its Western allies cannot be expected to underpin the security of others everywhere and indefinitely. He says Africa has enough soldiers of our own. However, more can be done to help with technical assistance, advanced weaponry, intelligence, and ordnance. The U.S. airstrikes last month against al-Shabaab in Somalia, the first of the Biden administration, show what can be and should be done. But what Africa needs most from the U.S. is a comprehensive partnership to close the disparity between our economic and demographic growth. He says, despite 6 of the world's top 10 fastest growing economies, my continent's gross domestic product gains are insufficient to provide for a burgeoning population. Since the start of the US-led war on terror in 2001, Africa's population has nearly doubled, and it's going to double again in, I believe, 30 years. Every day, every month, this means more unemployed or underemployment entering the labor market, far outstripping economic expansion. A lack of hope is the chief recruiting sergeant for the continent's new brand of terrorism. Now, this is interesting that he's drawing the necessary parallel. Terrorism is, again, not people who get up one day and say, hey, I hate freedom. This is what we've been told. We've been lied to by the media. These people, they just hate freedom. They just hate rights. They hate human rights. They hate seeing that you have your own religion. They just hate it. No, this is something that comes about whenever you have a continent that is unable to provide for people. This is what is the necessary outcome. You can't have a people who are starving over and over again, perpetually over time, and think that they're just going to find ways to go away quietly. These are cries for help many times. These are cries for true organization inside of the country that's going to feed the people, that's going to take care of the people. And the more that the country has these burgeoning, economies, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that Nigeria is facing this problem while also being called the #1, fastest growing economy in Africa, because the contradictions are there. How am I in the fastest growing economy inside of Africa, and yet I can barely feed my family? How am I in the fastest growing economy in Africa, and yet my entire community is devastated? How are we in the fastest growing economy in Africa, and the vast majority of us can barely even make sure that we have food on our table? So these contradictions are present, and the contradictions incite a real sense of powerlessness inside of people. And powerlessness is what always manifests into self-alienation. So whenever you're feeling as a self-alienated individual, you're bound to do things that are extreme because you're put inside of circumstances and environments that are extreme. So the next time someone says extremism is the greatest threat to Africa, your answer should be, of course, extreme conditions are the greatest threat to Africa. That is extremism. Extremism is having the fastest growing economy in the continent, 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world, and yet the fastest growing African population of people who are poor and dying, and the economy is not even able to feed a drop in the bucket of those people. That is extreme. And those are the standards, the language that we should use whenever we're addressing the system. Now let's go on. He says what we need above all is investment in infrastructure. Transport and freight lines can spread opportunity across nations, unequal in economic strength. In parts of Africa, a government's grip on remote territories can be tenuous. Militant groups stepped into the void. This is true. Some can even provide a form of governance, however perverse. This is true. These areas must be connected with their surroundings. So we hear a little truth coming through even the colonial plea and beg to master for help and for assistance. When he says that we need investment in infrastructure, let's distance from infrastructure. We need Africa to decolonize. We need African people to control their own lives. We need sovereignty. We need African people to be able to develop an Africa that is good for them. That is very, very much true. And this is not necessarily what he's saying, but I'm putting it into words that actually do reflect the actual conditions of our people. If you understand, again, what causes insurgency, what causes terrorism, it's not people who just hate freedom. It's people who don't have anything else to live for, and their only means of survival is to join with other people who are similarly minded, similarly situated. And he even says something very important. He says that some of these militant groups can provide a form of governance. That's very true. When you're thinking about how gangs, groups who are those that come together because of the ills of society, if you think about how they run, they have their own form of governance whenever the government has failed to come in and actually do what it's supposed to do. So if you're living in a state that is a failed state, a colonial state, a state that has no promise of a future for the people, and you have you're basically a stateless person, you're going to connect with people who are similarly minded, who could provide a form of stability. So that was actually true if you think about the fact that we have these smaller governments, these groups who are decentralized, who are spread out, and trying to make decisions in the best interest of their identified group. The problem, of course, is that we're not all together, and understanding that there should be no animosity between our people whenever we're all facing the same enemy, that we do have a common interest that goes beyond our local or religious groups. It goes towards our African continent. And if we understand that, then we can also have a form of governance that goes outside of the borders of our countries. And that form of governance would actually be powerful and would be self-actualizing. Because if we understand that as a people, we are inside of a system that is broken and meant to be broken, that puts the onus on us to develop and organize a system that is going to do right by us and do right by our communities. So it's not for the good that we have this issue of all these different groups. It's certainly not for the good, but it's very much predictable and it's very understandable given the horrible conditions that exist for many of our African people. Now he says in ending, ultimately Africans need not swords and plowshares to defeat terror. We require technological and intelligence support that our armies do not possess. Yet the boots we need on the ground are those of constructors, not the military. Africa's fight against terrorism is the world's fight. We will defeat them one highway, one rail link, and one job at a time. So the thing that I think that Buhari probably didn't mean to do, but he did, is that he linked the insurgency, the terrorism, these groups that are doing horrible atrocities, he linked them to the economic situation. But the common sense thing has to be, well, Africa didn't just wake up poor one day. Africa didn't just come out and say, hey, let's just be unstable. No, these are conditions that have been enforced on the people. So again, as a neocolonial puppet, you're not going to point to the truth that what Africa has in common is that Africa was under siege and colonized, but you're going to try to find ways to find other ways to be flowery about it, So it's not that we've been colonized; it's that we just need investment and we need infrastructure, we need rail lines. And my thing is like, what is the point of these rail lines if people don't have jobs to go to? But this is him just talking. No mention of reparations for the colonial state, because he's a puppet, obviously, but no mention of the fact that Africans have been brutalized by the West. In fact, no mention of the contradiction that is presented when you're asking the people who destabilized you, who humiliated you, who deprived you, who continue to deprive you. You're asking those people, same people, for help. No mention of those contradictions. Hopefully we start to understand just how insane the colonial system is, because it is insane. If you understand how these things are working, we're asking people who don't have our interest in mind, but the people who are asking are people who also don't have our interest in mind. And we're going to somehow get to a place where Africa is better off than what it was. Of course, this is nonsensical. African people must control their destinies and must be sovereign. The idea that a country can redeem you, that should have been killed to me a long time ago. Any true analysis of what insurgents of military Western troops do inside of a country would say that idea should have been dead a long time ago. But unfortunately, for many of our people, we continue to allow these narratives to go because there are people who are benefiting from the narratives. So I just thought this story was interesting because Buhari, again, probably unbeknownst to him or maybe unintentionally, directly talked about the colonial situation without talking about the colonial situation. So now it's on us African people to talk about the colonial situation in an outward and direct fashion and call for true true rehabilitation of the African continent. But that can't even be done until we get these people out of our affairs, out of our economies, out of our land. And that's going to take a revolution and not development. So that's all I have on this. I would love to hear your thoughts. And again, everyone, I'll be on a brief hiatus, but hopefully you'll follow me on my Telegram group and also my Instagram. And with that, I will see you all in the next video. Hey family, this is Tierney Cherie. I'm here to make an announcement that I'm very, very excited to make. I'm excited because I really think this is something that is important for our people. Otherwise, I would not have devoted so much time and energy towards it. So I finished my first book, and the book title is Fostering False Identity, the Child Welfare System's Design of Social Control of the Black Family. Now, why is this book something that I think will be very important for our community? Well, number one, it's dealing with the system of white supremacy, particularly the way that the system has targeted our children. If you don't know, our children are literally our future. Without our children, we have no future. And so understand that the system is very crafty when figuring out what to derail first. And to me, it's no mistake that the system particularly went after the Black family. If you look at what happened whenever we were enslaved by this system, and continues to go after the Black family, continues to go after Black children, continues to try to villainize African parents. So for that, I wanted to particularly talk about this subject. Now, the other thing that the book will deal with is our African identities. Why is it that our African identities are a threat to this system? Why is it that whenever we want to identify ourselves as being African, we get so much drawback inside of the Black community? I think a lot of us are not aware of the history of assimilationist thought inside of our community, this idea that we have to be close to white in order to be accepted. And so that's another subject that we delve into in this book. So I'm hoping that anyone who is, obviously, if you're a parent, a Black parent, and you really want to understand why it is that these systems are going after your children, I encourage you to read this book. I hope that it will arm you with a lot of knowledge and a lot of foresight, not just about how to protect your own children, but how to organize in your community, because that's really the purpose of the book, is to say that we have to organize among ourselves in order to protect ourselves from this white supremacist system. And then obviously, if you're an organizer in general, this is something that I think is important for you to read, because like I said, this is a subject in the Black community that we just don't discuss enough. Child welfare is not something that is going to get enough attention. People, obviously, we organize them around other causes, but this is one that is really important that I feel like we have to pay more attention to.